Welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology on Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. In the previous videos, we talked about the superficial and intermediate layers of the back muscles, and we mentioned that those are not true back muscles. Even though they exist on the back, that's their physical location, they don't actually facilitate movements of the spine. So in the superficial layer, we had latissimus dorsi, we had trapezius, we had the rhomboids, major and minor, and the levator scapulae. In the intermediate layer, we had the serratus posterior, superior, and inferior muscles. And those, none of them actually involve movements of the back. They may involve movements of the ribs, the arms, that is the humerus, or the scapula, but no back movements. So in the previous video, the one directly before this in the playlist, we then switched gears and looked at the deep layer of the back. These are the true back muscles because they all are going to facilitate some movement of the spine. And it depends on which muscles. We saw, first of all, the splenius muscles. They're going to facilitate neck extension, and then if one side contracts and not the other, ipsilateral neck rotation. And then we moved into the erector spinae muscle group and saw that these were powerful back extensors. When you perform a Roman chair exercise at the gym or you're doing the back extensor machine, these are the principal muscles that you're working. And so these are back extensors, assuming both contract at the same time. And then if you only have one contract, let's say the right side, then you'd have ipsilateral lateral flexion. Okay, so same side lateral flexion, in other words. Now, I mentioned that out of the deep layer itself is subdivided into three layers. Okay, the deep layer has a superficial, intermediate, and deep. Okay, so three sublayers within the deep layer. The superficial layer of the deep layer are the splenius muscles. The intermediate layer are the erector spinae group, which are deep to the splenius group. And now in this video, we're going to switch gears and talk about the deep of the deep. These are the deepest in the back. Okay? And these are going to be the transversospinalis and the segmental muscles, which we're going to cover in a few minutes. So, transversospinalis. Let's first talk about why they're called that, because this could give us an important clue as to origins and insertions when you're learning them. Okay? Transversospinalis, they're going to go up the spine, and they're going to run transversely. That's one way you could think about it. That's not why they're named this way. But all of these are going to have insertions that are medial to their origins. If you look at these muscles right here, actually zoom in a little bit, notice that they're all running, as they go up, they're moving medially. So they're kind of moving partially transversely. They're moving toward the spine. Now that's not why they're named that way, but that can help you. If you see a muscle that's moving upward and medially toward the spine, it's a big clue that it may actually be a transversospinalis muscle. Okay? The actual reason why they're named transversospinalis is actually because they all originate on transverse processes. So all three of these muscles, semispinalis, multifidus, and rotatores, they're all going to originate on the transverse process. Now they're going to insert on different parts of the vertebra, but they all originate there. And that's why they're called transversospinalis. But the way that you can recognize one, or that you probably have one, is that as they move up, they move medially. Okay? So out of the transversospinalis, we're going to talk first about the semispinalis and the multifidus. Okay? So first for semispinalis. The semispinalis are going to originate on the transverse processes, mainly in the C4 to T12 region, and then they're going to insert on the spinous processes above that in the cervical and thoracic region. So let's look here at this part of the muscle, this particular segment of it. We see that it originates laterally. That would be the transverse process of one of these vertebrae, and as it moves up, it seems to be moving medially. And it's going to insert on the most medial part of a vertebra, which is the spinous process. Okay? Therefore, transversospinalis. And the semispinalis are always going to originate on transverse processes and insert on spinous processes. Okay? And when we talk about the semispinalis action, they're going to be extensors of the neck and the spine. Okay? They're not as powerful as the erector spinae muscle group, but they're going to strongly assist in that back extension. Or if you're in the neck, neck extension. Now, let's suppose you have one of them contract, so left or right. Let's suppose it's the right side of the semispinalis that contracts. Well, it's going to produce what we call contralateral rotation. So if you were to rotate your spine to the left, that would actually be due to the right semispinalis. So contralateral means opposite side. So if the left semispinalis contracted, then it would produce rotation to the right, so spinal rotation to the right. All right, that's semispinalis. Now let's talk about the multifidus and compare it to the semispinalis. One thing important about the semispinalis is that they're most prominent in the cervical region. Okay, so actually you can see we have a semispinalis capitis that inserts on the occiput, and there's also a cervical part of this, so it's most prominent up here. In contrast, the multifidus is most prominent in the lumbar region of the spine. Okay? In fact, if you were to peel off the common aponeurosis of the erector spinae, you would actually see the multifidus directly under that. Okay? So here's the multifidus. Its origin is going to be the sacrum, and actually the posterior aspect of the common erector spinae aponeurosis. That's why if you peel it off, you see the multifidus, the posterior superior iliac spine, and the iliac crest. Now that looks like a lot of stuff, but just in general, it's going to originate in the pelvic region, all right? It's also going to originate on transverse processes and articular processes, okay? So if you go up further up the spine, it's not as prominent, but it does exist up there. And so once you get up here, it'll start originating on transverse processes in the thoracic region, so T1 to T12. If you're up near the top of the spine in the cervical region, it will actually originate on articular processes, C4 to C7. But again, regardless of where it's originating or what part of the spine, it's inserting medially. Again, if we look at the multifidus, let's actually zoom in here, the fibers are actually going to be running medially as they move up. Not very apparent here, but if you're going to move medially, again, it would make sense if you're inserting on a spinous process because that's the most medial part of each vertebra. Okay? And one thing important about the multifidus is that each segment of the muscle is going to span about 2 to 4 segments. And again, that depends strongly on where on the spine you are. But it's going to go up 2 to 4 segments. So if you had one that went up 3 segments, let's say it originated on the transverse process of T4. Well, if it went up 3 segments, it would insert on the spinous process of T1. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Now, unlike some of these other muscles, so whether it's the Transversospinalis or erector spinae group, it really does not produce any significant movements. It's a stabilization muscle for the spine. And actually, as you're sitting or standing right now, depending, even if you're not doing any activity per se, the multifidus is always and constantly making postural adjustments. So this muscle is actually going to be loaded with type 1 muscle fibers. It's not very strong, doesn't have a lot of power, but it has a lot of endurance and is required all day, every day to maintain posture. If you have a damaged and so if you have a weakened or a damaged multifidus muscle, you're going to have significant issues with posture and then also some back pain. Okay? So stabilization is mainly what it does of the spine. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the Rotatores, which is the last part of the Transversospinalis. Again, this is going to be the same kind of thing. It's going to originate on the transverse processes all over the spine, whether it's cervical, thoracic, or lumbar. And then it's going to insert, this is kind of complicated, but the junction of the transverse process, the lamina, and the spinous process of the vertebra above. Okay, we're just going to simplify that and say the lamina. Okay, so this is actually mainly what we associate the Rotatores with. It's going to actually insert on the lamina above. Now, there are 2 types of Rotatores. There's Rotatores brevis and Rotatores longus. Okay, and the brevis is going to extend up 1 segment, whereas the Rotatores longus extends up 2 segments. So let me give you an example of this to illustrate what I'm talking about. Suppose we're talking about the L4 vertebra. Okay, L4. The Rotatores brevis, associated with L4, would originate on the transverse process of L4, but then insert on the lamina of L3. Why? Because it's ascending 1 segment. The Rotatores longus, associated with L4, would originate on the transverse process of L4, but insert on the lamina of L2, because the longest part of it is actually going to move up 2 segments. And so it's important to realize that actually the rotatories brevis and rotatories longus are actually 2 separate muscles, but we just collectively call them rotatories. And their action is to stabilize, extend, and rotate. Okay? So again, they're going to produce contralateral rotation. So if the right rotatories contract, you're going to rotate the torso to the left. They assist in extension of the spine, but they're not significant. Okay? And then they also play a role in stabilization of the spine along with the multifidus. Okay? All 3 of these transversospinales are innervated by the dorsal rami of the spinal nerves in the associated area. So again, they're segmentally innervated. So if we're talking about, let's say, the rotatories in the lumbar region, they're going to be innervated by dorsal rami of the lumbar spinal nerves. Same thing in the cervical region, it would be the dorsal rami of the cervical spinal nerve. So again, segmental innervation with the transversospinales, just like we saw with the erector spinae group. That's the transversospinales. The last group we're going to talk about are the deepest of all of them, and these are the segmental muscles. Segmental muscles are those that lie in between 2 adjacent vertebrae. They don't ascend 2, 3, or 4 levels. All they do is ascend 1 level, and that's consistent throughout the length of the spine. Okay? The first kind are what are called the intertransversari muscles. Now, again, you should think about this. Intertransverse. Well, they must exist between consecutive, or I should say adjacent transverse processes. So here's an example of an intertransversari muscle. If we had one that originated on the transverse process of L1, it would have to insert on the transverse process directly above, so T12. So it only spans up 1 segment. Okay? That's what makes for a true segmental back muscle. And so that's your intertransversaries. They always ascend 1 segment to the transverse process above. Okay? Again, they have segmental innervation by dorsal rami of the spinal nerves, just as we saw in the transversospinales. And what they do is they assist in back lateral flexion. And I say assist because they are not the major muscles that perform this action. Some of the major muscles that actually do this are the obliques. Also, the quadratus lumborum is also big on this. These only assist. So you're going to see a little bit of activity here, but they're not going to contribute to the major force of back lateral flexion. They just assist. Okay, the second muscle that we have here that's a segmental muscle is the interspinalis. Okay, and this should actually give you a clue of what it's between. It's between spin or spine. It makes sense, it's between spinous processes, right? Okay, so interspinalis, here we go, here's where they exist. They exist in the cervical region, and they're also very prominent in the lumbar region. Okay, but again, these are going to originate on a spinous process and insert directly above to the adjacent spinous process. So for example, if we have one of these interspinalis that originates on the spinous process of C5, it would insert on the spinous process above at C4. Okay? And again, we're going to find these actually in the cervical region and the lumbar region. The intertransversari are actually going to be mostly in the thoracic region, although there's going to be some in the upper lumbar, but mostly thoracic. Okay? And with the interspinalis muscles, they're also going to be segmentally innervated. I think we beat that to death what that means. And these muscles are going to only assist in back extension. Okay, we know at this point that the major back extension muscles are the erector spinae group. Okay? And so when you go do the back extensor machine at the gym, you're working the erector spinalis. The interspinalis are only going to assist in that. So the majority of the force is not provided by these, but they're going to provide a little bit, only contribute and assist. All right? And so that right there takes us really through the end of the true back muscles. We're going to talk about some more aspects of this in the next few videos, but I hope you enjoyed this one and learned a lot. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you very much.